Okay, welcome back. I'm glad you're here. I really hope that you've worked since we weren't together on bringing up what's repressed. And if you have, then you're feeling kind of good about yourself and feeling like this all might really have some value after all, and you might be able to be happier and healthier and more whole and live a fuller life, and for sure be more compassionate about all the people who don't look just like you and act just like you do. Having talked about the repressed center, which is determined by which of the three centers, thinking, feeling, and doing, is repressed, now we're going to move into talking about the dominant center. And that's determined by which one's dominant, thinking, feeling, or doing. So you bring up repressed, but you got to manage what's dominant. And it would be easier to push it down than to manage it. But that's not an option. You're going to have to learn to manage it. If you don't, it will end up managing you. So that's the option that you have. The dominant center for 2s, 3s, and 4s is feeling. And there are a lot of different understandings about emotion and feeling. For me, emotions are outward expressions of internal feelings. So the feelings happen on the inside, emotions happen on the outside. Both emotions and feelings are sensations that are experienced by all human beings. Feelings are triggered by external stimuli, and emotions come from your mind and possibly from your soul, I think. Feelings can include physical sensations along with mental status, and emotions always come from your mind, they say. That's what the experts taught me. Feelings are often temporary, and they subside once the stimulus is no longer present. And emotions can stay with you for years and years and years because they're seated in your mind. So we have a lot of emotional theories that state that there are 5 emotions that are similar to all cultures: love, hate, joy, sorrow, and fear. This triad is about reaching out to other people and hoping they reach back. That's what 2s, 3s, and 4s are all about, reaching out to you and hoping you reach back. It's about love and empathy and connection and loss and pain. These are folks who are concerned with approval and disapproval from other people, and they're very familiar with anxiety, so they turn all emotions into anxiety. And all 3 of these numbers, 2s, 3s, and 4s, adapt. So I want you to think about adapters for technology. You know, if you've ever been to Europe, you have to take an adapter in order for your hairdryer to work. So essentially, adapters are connectors that make something connect to something else and then work in a foreign place. Well, what you got to think about then in terms of all 3 of these numbers as adapting is that we adapt ourselves to make us work in your world. It's a fascinating thing, and it's tiring. If you scratch the surface just a little bit under 2s, 3s, and 4s, what you get is shame. And they all feel pulled toward the outer world. Now, 4s are inner focused, but they also feel pulled toward the outer world. Emotions are not made, they're allowed for heart people. And anxiety and activity crowd them out. And for them, life is a task. There's a goal here to create a life that's connected to all other people. In each triad, one type externalizes the emotion, one internalizes it, and the third has forgotten it. So 2s externalize feelings. And what that means is they overexpress them. 3s have kind of forgotten about feelings, and that means they're the most out of touch with their feelings. And 4s have internalized feelings, and that means they underexpress them. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't give them a lot of attention. It means they underexpress them. In relation to feelings, 2s feel what other people feel. 3s set feelings aside. Now, for 3s, feelings are dominant and repressed. Now, think about that, dominant and repressed, and here's what that means. They use feelings to take in information, but they don't use feelings to process the information that they've taken in. So they have feelings that come, and they set them aside with every plan of dealing with them later. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And 4s exacerbate high feelings, and they exacerbate low feelings. This triad's made up of an aggressive type, and a dependent type, and a withdrawing type. And the aggressive type is the 3, and they move against other people. And the dependent type is the 2, and they move toward other people. And the withdrawing type is the 4, and they move away from other people. 2s, and I am a 2, of course, and I'm aware that we can be what you want us to be, but we have to do a lot of work to know what we feel for you. We're all struggling with feeling controlled by other people's needs. I feel that a lot. And we work to find a way to manage our anger. We feel when our real needs are not being met, and we're trying to really meet yours. But anger doesn't suit us in relationship. So we rename it, and we set it aside. And we don't admit to ourselves, much less to anybody else, that we've overcommitted ourselves to meeting the needs of other people. Some of these issues stem from childhood. Everything does, I suppose. But we 2s know that we were loved as children, but we have being loved confused with being helpful and pleasing, and being loved for being helpful and pleasing. And it seems like we've signed up for a lifetime commitment of trying to keep affection coming our way. 2s get their sense of themselves from how other people respond to them or how other people react to them. And we're generally far more of the ways to accommodate others than we are aware of our motives for accommodating others. So quite frankly, our attention is so trained to focus outward, personal needs are usually disregarded, so the work can be done to ensure that we're loved by you and wanted by you. It's really easy for 2s to fall into what someone else wants, while it's very difficult for them to know what they want. So 2s, in order to balance out or manage your dominant stance, you're going to need to do several things. And the first is this: learn to recognize personal needs and learn to stabilize a consistent sense of yourself that doesn't change or adapt in order to meet the needs of other people. Second, you have a much better chance of what you need or what you want if you're alone. Because when you're with somebody else, you're really tuned in to what they need and what they want. And finally, 2s need to recognize when attention shifts from real feelings to compliance with the feelings of other people. Now, of course, all this is very challenging when your security depends on pleasing other people. 3s, the American culture is, of course, a 3 culture. So 3s fit our ways of being very well. We like them. They don't appear to suffer, and we like that. And they present themselves as a picture of well-being and optimism, and we like that. And they don't seem to even know about the loss of connection that they have to their own interior life. 3s are people who work for external applause without even asking themselves how they feel about the work itself. And they're known to use work and activity as a natural antidepressant, which just takes them farther and farther and farther away from their feelings. 3s stay busy, and then feelings in life can't really get to them. With a packed schedule, there's no free time for feelings to come to the surface. But with some space and some time, personal feelings come into awareness for 3s. And so I want you to think about this. When you're focused on a task, and when you go into action, your feelings are suspended. It's like you put them on hold. And you know what happens? If during that time you receive a compliment, it's taken in, but then you give it to the project instead of keeping it for yourself. It's very difficult to compliment a 3. 3s are accustomed to multitasking, and they advocate keeping so many balls in the air as an efficient use of time. 3s, I want you to be aware that image is not everything, and the image that you present doesn't usually represent your emotional point of view. It's possible for you to live out an adopted image without ever getting in touch with your real emotional preferences. And 3s, be prepared, Because the realization that real feelings don't always match the roles and the things that others value in you can sometimes cause a lot of rage because you've spent a lot of energy creating all of that. 3s can change jobs and change identities without ever breaking stride, as long as there's enough activity and enough hope for a better future. Then you can keep all negative feelings at bay. And you know, if you get to the next thing fast enough, there's no feeling of failure about the last thing. And there's no learning from the failure of the last thing either. So 3s, in your search for balance and managing your dominant stance, you could try learning to stop. You need to allow some time for emotions and real opinions to surface. Be aware when you feel like a fraud, and sometimes you do. 3s, if you can't name a feeling but you feel like you're having one, then name any physical sensations that go with that, because that's a good place to start. And you have a unique way of confusing an idea about a feeling with the real thing. So be sure that what's happening is not in your head, that it's a feeling that you're having, not a feeling that you're thinking about. 4s. To understand 4s, we all have to understand this. Their moods over a 3-month period are unnameable, I would say. There are so many, they can't name them, they can't remember them, they can't connect to them. They have so many mood changes in an hour. It's so hard for them to know what to follow. You know how often we'll say something like, you know, I'm in the mood for a hamburger. Well, what I want you to know is if you're a 4 and you say, you know, I'm in the mood for a hamburger, by the time you get to the car, you may be like BJ in the story I told you before, and you may have given up meat. That's how fast it comes and goes. Melancholy for 4s is kind of sweet, because it's sweet regret. And when observed by others, 4 melancholy is labeled depression. For 4s, it's kind of a poetic sadness. The core issues for 4s are poor self-image, because all 4s believe they're flawed, and fear of abandonment. And 4s, you're caught in pushing and pulling in relationships. We've already talked about that, but you know that you hold life at a safe arm's length because outsiders seem to understand the world in a way that you don't, and you feel like an outsider to normal, everyday reality. Now, all that's very complex, but you see, happiness is a threat to 4s because they've seen so many people fake it. And what they're looking for is joy. C.S. Lewis does a great job of talking about the difference in joy and happiness. And happiness is something that you can create, and joy is something that you receive. It comes from outside of you to you. And so for 4s, creating happiness doesn't work. Receiving joy is how they want to position themselves. 4s are impatient with ordinary feelings. They preferred textured, deep feelings. Experts say that there are basically 3 types of 4s. There are 4s who are melancholy or depressed for real. There are 4s who are basically hyperactive. And there are 4s who find their way swinging between those 2 extremes. 4s search for depth and meaning, and that often misleads them into thinking that light-hearted connections are not significant and that they don't matter. And at the end of the day, life is made up of light-hearted connections, one after another. So that's a big loss. And I would say that 4s are really drawn to the times and the places where the veil is very thin between this world and whatever is next or whatever isn't next. That thin veil between what you can see and what you can't see. So 4s, you're going to have to manage to find some balance, and the only way you can do that is to learn to deal with all of this stuff around feelings. And I don't mean all of this stuff in a disrespectful way, but for you, there's a lot of it. Retreating to the past and dreaming and fantasizing about the future are neither one good for you in terms of transformation. So try not to do that. Learn to practice returning your attention to the present moment. Just come back to the present moment. And when you work on moving toward others and then continuing to move toward what's important to them without bringing up what's important to you. You have lots and lots of beautiful, wonderful qualities that are enviable. And this is the one challenge that I think you won't pick up and run with, and I want you to. I want you to start making a list of the qualities that you think you have that someone else would envy, because you're so caught in envying the qualities of other people. And remember, you have a tendency to ask for advice and then reject it. So why don't you practice asking for some and then following it? All right, the dominant center for 5s, 6s, and 7s is thinking. And if you talk about thinking as an adjective, the dictionary says rational and reasoning and thoughtful and reflective. If you use it as a verb, it's to have a conscious mind to some extent that involves reasoning and remembering experiences and making rational decisions. Now, I want you to think carefully before you begin to employ your mind in all that I'm going to hand to you now. Because this triad is about people who have detailed future plans. I have a dear friend who survived breast cancer and now is battling ovarian cancer. And she has a 20-year plan. And she had it before the cancer returned. A 20-year plan. I have a 20-day plan, but I'm only familiar with tomorrow, actually. These are people who overcome fear by bringing the best. And they have a hard time making decisions and moving into the future. And if they don't feel a strong sense of guidance and support, they are anxious. And sometimes they wait way too long to move forward toward other people, and then it's too late, and they feel overlooked and unimportant. Remember, in each type, one of the emotions is externalized, one is internalized, and one's forgotten. 5s internalize fear, which means they underexpress it. They think about it a lot, but they don't express it. And 6s externalize fear. And 7s are the most out of touch with their fear. In relation to fear, thinking about it in this triad is seldom productive. So here's what 5s do. They think and gather information and hoard knowledge until they've over-specialized, and what they have to work with is irrelevant. And then they manage their fear by gathering more information, which is neither knowledge nor wisdom. And 6s spend their mental energy on worst-case scenario planning and scanning the horizon for danger, and so little of what they plan for actually happens. And 7s spend their energy, all of their mental energy, focused on possible future positive events. And so they manage fear with a smokescreen of activity. And like other triads, this one is made up of an aggressive type and a dependent type and a withdrawing type. 7s move against other people, they're aggressive. 6s move toward others and they're dependent. And 5s are withdrawing, meaning they move away from other people. 5s, keeping a safe distance for you means not getting involved. And you see the more feeling types like me who juggle strong desires and emotional intensity as lacking control, and I suspect that I do. 5s are self-contained, independent people. And while control is a favorite illusion for most of us, 5s control situations by ceasing to react to them. Now that's fascinating. To be able to control something by just not responding to it fascinates me. 5s are most comfortable when they're alone. So when they can't be alone, they have all of these ways of deflecting attention off of themselves and onto somebody else. And they can disappear into a pose or a costume or a shell or the magic shield that we've talked about. And when they cannot withdraw, they simply disengage from feelings. So 5s, what can you do to manage and balance dominant thinking? First, keep your mind and emotions connected to one another. And then you can learn to be appropriately vulnerable. You're going to have to be affected by other people. That's a good thing. And try feeling your own desires. And you need to be aware that you bond with people one-to-one when you exchange confidential information. And if you don't exchange some information that's personal, you're never going to be deeply connected to anybody. And I know that it's so risky for you, but oh my gosh, it's so worth the risk. I wanted my mom to come to an Enneagram workshop before she died so badly. She was a 5 on the Enneagram, you remember, and I tried to get her to come. And she will come when I'm teaching something else, or she would when she was alive. And she would go on women's retreats when I was leading women's retreats, but she would not come to an Enneagram workshop. And I said, you know, this is the work of my life. Why won't you come? And she said, because you already know more about me than I want you to, and I'm not going to sit in a room and confirm anything that you're thinking. 6s. All 6s have a significant relationship to authority. Some put all of their trust in authority, and others watch to see that the people in authority aren't taking advantage of folks. 6s have problems following through on things because they're so afraid to act on their own behalf, and they report that they felt powerless as children, so they have trouble taking action as adults. On the other hand, they overvalue people who take action and move ahead. And sometimes they look for manipulative hands that people aren't carrying. They like to join groups with like-minded people because it helps them manage their fear and their anxiety. And with 6s, there's a lot of looking for an external cause to explain internal fear, and that's very hard on relationships. I'm going to say that again because it's half the world and it's really important. 6s spend a lot of time looking for an external cause to explain an internal fear, and that's very hard on relationships. There's a big, big difference between courage and faith. And 6s are looking for courage, and they need faith in something that's bigger than they are. So 6s, let's look for some ways to find some balance. First of all, practice shifting your attention when you're aware that you're scanning the horizon for danger. And here's one practice that you can do. When something happens that kind of scares you, almost anything, stop and think. How would a 1 respond to this? How about a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or a 7 or a 9? And then try it. Second, and this might be the most important thing I suggest for you, notice when you're looking for hidden meaning and hidden motives in other people. I didn't think it would be all that frequent, but as it turns out, it's pretty frequent in 6s. And third, doubt shuts people out, so be aware of that. 7s, it's a reality that you're in the fear triad, but nobody would guess that because you move ahead with such charm and grace. And your fear really doesn't show because you've diffused it with limitless possibilities that come from your unending imagination. Peter Pan was surely a 7, eternally a child. But there are 2 sides to everything, and the joy of the Peter Pan worldview is tamed by the fact that it's very difficult for you 7s to hear the truth about you when it's mirrored back from somebody who loves you. 7s move away from pain toward pleasure, and then they just remember the best. And for 7s, every day is brimming with possibility, and the idea is to stay upbeat until just before things get so boring you can't stand them, and then follow that and move on to something else. And stay upbeat until just when you can't stay anymore, and then move on to something else. The fascination with many things masks the fear of going too deeply into anything. So don't give in to that if you're a 7. Balancing and managing thinking then is going to sound something like this. All of your interests appear to be related. And that makes you believe that you're heading somewhere. But if you put them all out on a piece of paper, they're probably not related to one another. 7s, you love to plan and anticipate, but there's an obvious evasive aspect to planning and planning and planning. And there's a powerful link for 7s between thinking and doing, so be aware of that and be smart. When we've been raising a child who's a 7, we've often said to one another, what are we going to do with him? He just thinks about it and then he goes and does it. And then he'll think of something else and then he goes and does that. Everybody needs help sometimes, 7s. So pay attention to that, because when you need help, you think you're defective in some way. All right, 8, 9s, and 1s, the dominant center for you is doing. This is commonly referred to as the gut center. You're the doing, bodily centered triad. And if you're in this triad, you sense or feel the world in your belly. So you use language like, I know it in my gut. And you read harmony or the lack of it and hidden agendas all right here in your gut. And so what you do is you make your way through life with instinctual knowing. You're people who are pulled both inward and outward. And focusing on one and then the other is followed by trying to control both. And you're people who convert varying emotions into anger, and anger might not be pleasant, but it's very familiar to you. People in this triad hold their ground rather than adapt, so they've got some boundary issues where yours end and where other people's begin. And in this triad, when you're weak-boundaried, 8s, you take on too much. And 9s, you merge. And 1s, you do your part and the part of other people, and then you resent it. In this triad, people generally hide emotions. And the first person that you try to control is you. 8s externalize anger. They overexpress it. And 9s have forgotten anger. They're kind of out of touch with it. And 1s internalize anger, which means they underexpress it and it becomes resentment. In relation to anger, 8s, your anger's straight up and then it's over, and I kind of value that. But your doing is extreme, and you do too much, and you go and do until you drop. And 9s, your anger's passive-aggressive. And for you, doing is both dominant and repressed. And so what that means is you're always doing. And sometimes you're doing what needs to be done, but frequently you're just doing what you want to do. And 1s, your anger's turned inward, and when it becomes resentment, doing gets focused on perfecting things. And when you don't pay close attention, your resentment builds up and builds up and builds up, and then it spills over onto other people, and it's painful for everybody. This triad's made up of an aggressive type, which is the 8, and a dependent type, which is the 1, and a withdrawing type, which is the 9. 8s, the central question for you is this: who has the power, and will they be fair? And so you operate from a worldview where you believe the strong survive and the weak do not. And you meet the world straight up and head on, and you're looking for security, particularly in 2 ways. 1, knowing who you're up against, and 2, knowing who has your back. This is a very interesting piece that makes it a challenge to read 8s, so pay close attention. They're aggressive, so their core number is in the aggressive stance. But in stress, they move to 5, so they move away from people. And in security, they move to 2, so they move toward people. And in their core number at 8, they move against people. And so what we all know is it's very hard to read an 8, because sometimes they're moving towards you, and sometimes they're moving away from you, and sometimes they're moving against you. And that doesn't happen other places. 8s try to maintain control over all the things that might influence their lives. And mature 8s learn to value and see each person's truth from their point of view. Following some experiences with trustworthy relationships in friendship or with a boss, 8s begin to seek and understand and value compromise. 8s, I want you to try these ideas for finding some balance for your dominant center. When you suddenly feel the need to protect yourself, I would love it if you would stop and identify the thought or the experience or the feeling that caused you to pull back. Delegating is an art, and it will serve you well. Learn it. Allow people to take care of you sometimes. You're going to need to do that. You remember the story I told you about our friend who has cancer, who doesn't know what vulnerability is because he hasn't spent any time in his life letting people take care of him? You better practice that. You're going to need it someday. Because you are, number one, misunderstood, and because, number two, you take on the battles of those you love, you repress your own tenderness and your own vulnerability. And I want you to please remember that vulnerability is how people connect to people. Think about that. Vulnerability is how people connect to people, and you want that. 9s, you so easily replace your agenda with somebody else's. It's fascinating to me. And then you can even merge your enthusiasm about their agenda. But there's a difference between being agreeable and being committed. And that's big. 9s are angry about being overlooked, and they're angry about not being heard. And they're very capable of being stubborn about choosing. But once they choose, they can be equally stubborn about holding on to their choice. The most natural space for a 9 is fence sitting. 9s are mediators precisely because they're able to agree but not fully commit to a point of view. Now that's lovely unless you're married to that. People who agree but don't fully commit, or unless you're trying to parent or work with or for or beside. 9s are caught in an unusual place at the top of the Enneagram between 8s who have a very feisty image and 1s who just want to be good. And 9s solve the problem of choosing to comply or rebel by not choosing either one. 9s are truly capable of unconditional love because they have no desire to make other people change. Now, in a world where we are all trying to change one another to suit ourselves, isn't it fascinating that there's a personality type that doesn't have a desire to try to make other people change? So let's explore some things that you might do to manage your dominant center. One of the most important things you can do is this: learn to take a stand. You can change your mind. Women do it all the time. Second, every 9 I've ever met has 1 or 2 things that they've always wanted to do. Pick one and go do it. Third, please give some serious thought to what you lose and what you gain when you merge with other people, because I believe that'll be the beginning of merging less. And I can tell you, people who love you are just dying to know what you want. They want to know that so much, but they want to know specific words and actions. So give that to them. One of your greatest assets is that you're not intimidated. You can assert yourself without being aggressive. I would love to be able to do that. That's quite a gift. And 1s, you're the people who grew up aware of and following all the rules. And your desires for your life included being responsible and behaving properly and to be seen as good by other people. You monitor yourself all the time to avoid criticism. We watch it in our grandson. He's just 6. After church, he'll come up to Joe and say, "Granddaddy, was I a good boy?" You deny yourself pleasure intuitively. That's dangerous, because when you deny yourself pleasure intuitively, you fail to learn moderation. There's always room to do things better, the critic reminds you constantly. And there's a right way to do everything, but there's more than one right way to do everything. Perfection's a pretty tough assignment. One's you're usually out of touch with what you really want and over-focused on what you think should be done. And one of the things that you must embrace is, while things may not be perfect, you know what? Most things are good enough. They're just good enough. Anger is a powerful motivation for you. It provides you the energy you need to fix and do and manage. And while it amazes me, I've learned that sometimes you're unaware of your anger. You usually discount how strong it is and how forceful it is. So in order for you to do this work, you're going to have to stop being so hard on yourself, because it means you're harder on the rest of us. Stop when you see that pattern of being hard on yourself and then trying to level the playing ground by being hard on other people. Who determines the standards that you set for yourself? And ask yourself, are your expectations even reasonable? Anne Lamott says this, and boy, you would do well to write it on an index card in every room in your house. Every expectation is resentment waiting to happen. And you don't need any more resentment. You've already turned your anger inward, and you've already got it built up. And for you, I got to tell you, procrastination's problematic. You need to just go ahead and try things you can't do perfectly. Figure out everybody loves you anyway. And you need to learn to ask for your needs to be met. And you're going to have to do that with some grace. And you're going to have to receive the gifts that come, and they're going to come imperfectly. I'm just going to tell you, at the end of the day, I'm positive that perfection is overrated. So, in closing, I want to tell you that one of my favorite saints is Teresa of Avila. I like her work, and I like the talk that she has going on about an interior castle. In fact, if you haven't read about it, go do that. And you might end up being like me. I want an interior castle. And she speaks a lot in her writings about the importance of being able to draw near to oneself on the journey. She says, without this approach to the self, there can be no growth. If you cannot draw near to yourself on the journey, there can be no growth. And she also says, the sinner is one who does not love the self enough. I'm going to paraphrase for you something that Suzanne Zurcher says. She's a Benedictine nun who's done quite good Enneagram work. And she says, what we learn in the second half of life is that what makes us sinners is not so much the thing we judge to be bad or wrong, but our misconception about what life is meant to be. The second task of life is never over. We learn and relearn the lessons of life over and over. And I would tell you that it does get harder and harder to fool ourselves about the emotions that we have. So in desperation, we gradually learn to make peace with what we can't get rid of. Non-acceptance of yourself is missing the mark. So, be nice to yourself. Accept who you are, with all that's good, and with all that's weaker, and with all that needs fixing. And take to heart what the wisdom of the Enneagram has to offer you, because life could be better. And I want that for me, and I want that for you. And I hope that that's what we're accomplishing in this process together. Thank you very much.
So we're each in different triads, meaning that we take in information in different ways. So my dominant center, the way that I take in information is by doing, and you by thinking, and you by feeling. So, I was thinking about how I do take in information, how I respond to the day. Like I literally wake up and I think about what is it that I need to do, and I live by to-do lists, and that's how I go about my day, is what it is that I need to do. And that's kind of as a 9, making sure that I am trying to do the things that I need to do. But it is really about what it is that I'm doing, and to try to manage that, I have to be conscious of thinking about, what is it that I need to do, so that I'm mindful of doing the things that I need to do, but also thinking about relational, life just isn't about this to-do list, but about, interacting with people and thinking about, do I need to stop what I'm doing and actually interact with this person and have a conversation, and get off of my schedule or, the track of what it is that I'm trying to accomplish and do.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about what you said about how you start your day. Well, I start my day quite differently, as one might expect. I start my day laying in bed, and my mind is going. It's just going, usually working on problems from the day before, okay? And so, and that pretty much characterizes what I'm doing the rest of the day, by the way. So I live in my head. I didn't know that before I encountered the Enneagram, but that's where I live. All of the major problems I've ever experienced in life, I solved them in my head. I now know that's not the only way, and there's a little problem with it, but I'm all about thinking. And how do I control it? How do I control that domination of thinking? Not very well, to tell you the truth.
Well, I think it's so much the way that we perceive the world, it's the way we take things in, that it's hard even until you learn the Enneagram be aware that there'd be any other way that people would wake up and start their day. I mean, I know if we're going on that same kind of idea, when I'm waking up, I'm either experiencing the feelings that I went to bed with the night before, or anticipating the feelings that are going to be coming for the upcoming day. And we never even have any thought or any other thing that there'd be a different way that people might experience it. And it's just so unique the way we all experience, take in from the world in that regard.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And for me, another one of the struggles then is knowing that the feelings that I have, the way that I take in, is one of the best things that I have to offer about me. And you talk about, how do you manage that in such a way that it's still, you're able to offer your family relationships, your friendships, your occupation, all that you have that's really great about you, but in a way that doesn't allow that to sort of run and wild in your life. And I know that can be incredibly difficult, like you were saying earlier, to really know how to do that well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's interesting that you said, you don't know if you really do manage or control things really well. And I don't think that I do either. And I was thinking, like, how do I really control or try to manage my doing? And I don't know that I do that very well. And I think that's probably why that is so dominant. It's just our natural way of being is by doing, for me as a 9 or an 8 or a 1. And I don't know if 8s and 1s are similar to this, but for me it's, I really struggle with when I kind of have this plan of all the things that I need to do and take care of. If things get off track of that, I have to really be conscious to stop and maybe take a breath and think, or actually feel, what it is that has happened that has gotten things off track, especially if it was out of my control, because I think control is a big thing in my triad as well. So it's so interesting to hear, that you literally are taking in by, especially thinking about or feeling and perceiving the way other people feel, and it's more just in my head. I'm all about what it is that I need to do, and so trying to manage that is being more mindful and thinking and thoughtful, as well as trying to, pay attention to what it is that I'm feeling, so that maybe I can do something a little bit differently, or thinking and being perceptive as to how other people feel as well, so that I can manage that doing and maybe do something a little bit differently.
Yeah, I know I experienced that when it comes to telling stories. I love to tell stories, and sometimes I get in trouble when the people that are a part of these stories are there too, and not just because I might be saying things about them, but because they're starting to say, that's really not how that went down. They're kind of calling me the carpet, like, well, what do you mean? And they're sharing with me their understanding, their experience of that same story. And I'm like, well, yeah, but that's just not as good of a story that way. And what I realize is that it's because I'm taking everything in through my feeling. I'm going to tell the story in whatever way I need to tell the story in order to be able to help people feel what I felt. Because it doesn't matter who started the fight here, who did that there. What I want is for people to leave that room feeling what I felt in the story that I wanted to share. And it was just mind-blowing. What other people, you actually care about, like, the facts? Like that would matter to somebody if this happened first? Don't we just want to ultimately know how I felt? And so that can be a gift. That can be a great thing if I'm using that in ways that really do help to move and motivate people in positive ways. Or it can be something that's incredibly manipulative in a way that gets me into all kinds of trouble with people when they're saying, you really didn't get that right, and you let those feelings take you to a really bad place there.
Yeah. Well, I have a friend, something you said reminded me, I have a friend who says our greatest strength and our greatest sort of shortcoming is the same thing. And I really do view it that way. And when I first realized that thinking dominated me in the way that it does, I was really kind of surprised, because I had thought of myself as a person who's, I'm a feeler, I like people. But now when I begin to really hone in and look at what I'm doing, I'm thinking all the time.
Yeah.
It just dominates for sure. But I do think it's important to say, so if the question is how do we control that? Well, in one sense, we don't, because it's part of our DNA. But it's also, I think, really important to remember that now that we know the Enneagram, we're aware of it. Mm-hmm. And we can do things to sort of ameliorate that in some way. And for example, one of the things that I do, it's sort of a meditation thing or a consciousness thing. It's like every now and then, I'll stop and say, don't respond just by thinking immediately. Intentionally move that feeling over and think about the people aspects and the emotional aspect of this before you go headlong into this goal setting and strategy and all of that sort of thing. So,
and I think it's similar for me with feeling as I'm going about my day, my career. I'm around lots of people all the time, and I can either take what I'm feeling and perceiving and make that all about me and make it about my agenda and my brokenness, and that leads to really ugly, messy places. Or I can choose to let that be a gift to the world, and as I'm taking everything in through my feelings, not be so attached to them, not be so driven by them, but still aware of them in a way that I can use that to help me know what it is you might be experiencing, but I don't have to necessarily make it all about me. I know as a two for me, and then I said, well, if he's feeling that way, is it something I've done? Is it something, what did I do here? And there's nothing to connect A to B necessarily, and I find that when I'm being healthier, I'm aware of that. Well, you may be feeling that, but that's not necessarily my responsibility. I can choose how I'm going to respond to what I'm feeling.
Yeah. That's our hope. We can choose how we're going to respond.
Yeah, sitting here thinking more about like how do I manage it, and something that you said about just kind of taking a moment, and for me too, taking a moment, stopping and just trying to kind of rest and allow things to happen and for things to just be and just to be present. And I know that kind of seems like that'd be natural for a 9, but it's not always, because we do want to respond and take things in by just being active and doing. But really, taking a moment, sitting, just kind of be present and to allow things to happen as they are and not try to be so in control of it by doing and managing things. But I'm practicing that. Not to say I'm doing it.
Well, it really is interesting how it takes a while to see it, but once you begin to see it, how differently we meet the world. Mm-hmm. There's this thing that's right in front of you, And it's so distinctive for the three of us. I think it's a little confusing with thinking, because in a sense we're all using our thinking to do those things. But once you see these three alternatives, these three possibilities, it's life-changing.
Most definitely.